Well, hey there, it's that coding guy here, breaking it down and making it accessible. Way back, I had the API Basic Concepts video where I really dug into the basics of 3-tier or N-tier architecture. And I made a promise in that video to talk about it in code. And now that I have enough of the Dungeon Keeper built so that we can actually see all of the layers, promise fulfilled. So let's jump in. And by the way, if you missed that video the first time, check it out. So we'll talk a bit about layered architecture here. And actually, let's go back to this real quick, because the basics of it are that we have some sort of presentation layer, some sort of data or logic, a service or a logic layer, and then a data layer. And we see that here in our overall architecture. You know, we've got UI with HTML and CSS and stuff. We've got the API, and then we've got the database. But we'll see these layers, those same three layers, right now in just our API. Layers having layers. So let's dig into it with the controller. So what's a controller's job? A controller's job is to define endpoints and call methods in the service layer. And that's pretty much it. I'm not saying that you can't have any logic. I'm not saying you can't have an if statement in your controller. What I'm saying is if you're doing any sort of validation or processing, all of that should live in the service layer. So this guy receives a request, it calls the service. That's the job of a controller. What's the job of a service then? I'm here in the service impl for our rooms domain. And I like to refer to the services as the workbench. We can do whatever we want. This is a place to make sure that the requests conform to our business logic. We may have validation rules. We may have other logic rules according to whatever business problem we're solving. And we only want to contact the database, which is a precious resource, when we absolutely have to. So we're going to do all of our processing here. We're going to do all of our validation here before we actually bother the data layer. So that's the job of the service layer, or the logic layer it may be referred to. And then only if absolutely necessary, we will contact the data layer. And the data layer here are represented by the repository. So I've got the room repository here. It's extending CRUD repository. And curiously, this is a completely blank implementation, which throws a lot of new people and not so new people who are new to repositories, at least. And then what's going on here? I have nothing defined here, but at the same time, I'm able to room repository.findAll. And the reason we're able to do that is because we're standing on the shoulders of giants here and utilizing this CRUD repository. And if I control click here, we see that we've got access to lots of different CRUD operations, which is probably a whole nother video in and of itself. But so the data layer, its job is to contact the database. And the cool thing about these repositories is we don't have to write all of those queries that I just took a look at. Like, the framework already knows how to do those. I don't have to implement a save. I just have to call the method on the repository and pass it what I want. This really frees us up as application developers when we need to do simple CRUD operations to just have at it. And then, of course, if we need to, we can always define custom queries and other implementations that we might need that the repository doesn't already provide. So data layer contacts the database on our behalf. And so that's it. So these layered architecture concepts are really just a convention, because there's nothing stopping us from using the room repository in this room controller and calling the repository directly from the controller without ever needing a service layer. Like, we could do all of our implementation just in this controller method if we wanted to, and it would still work, but it's not a good convention. So this helps us read and maintain code, because we know when we're looking at a controller, it's going to be dealing with endpoints. And when we're looking at a service file, it's going to be dealing with logic, and the data, or the repositories are going to be dealing with data. It really helps us compartmentalize these things into separated concerns, right? Separation of concerns is a big tenet in programming, and this really helps us do that. So it's a convention. It helps us standardize our code and our processes, and hopefully all of a team's projects would follow some of the same conventions there. And what I'll say too is that this is not just a Spring Boot concept. You'll see separation of concerns in a lot of places. If you look for it, you will see these same sorts of layers in a .NET project, for like a .NET framework API. You would see some of the same concepts in a React project or another type of UI framework project, where the UI itself with the HTML and CSS, you've got components that are strictly there for presentation, and then you've got some helper files that are helping deal with logic, and then you've probably got some sort of service files where all of the outside calls live that are contacting the database through fetches or AJAX calls or whatever. So you see these multiple layers implemented in different ways throughout projects, and all brings it back to that sanity, hopefully lending a little bit for those large projects. So cheers. I hope that helps. And if you have any questions on this stuff, or if it helped you out, leave me a comment, throw me a like, subscribe to the channel. It really helps when you interact with the channel. And I'd love to see all your questions and things like that. So cheers. Thanks for watching.